Good afternoon. My name is Hillary Hunt, and I serve as the director of the Making Sense Project. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar focused on personal finance standards and requirements in Pennsylvania, an update. One of the more recent presentations I gave on this was at the SAS Institute, and I said everything was up to the minute, and then literally the second session that I gave was the day that things were changing and legislation was passed. So I've tried to make sure that everything here is as up to date as possible, but they are reflective of this snapshot in time here as of really as of yesterday, because I haven't checked to see if anything else happened today, but I think we're right now in sort of a holding pattern. So the most up-to-date information that we can possibly provide. So I'm just going to, today on our agenda, we're going to give you just a little bit of background about the Making Sense Project for anybody that doesn't know about us, really briefly cover some upcoming opportunities, and then we'll dive right in. If you are interested in getting Act 48, staying on until the end, I will be making sure that you get a link to that evaluation form and Act 48 request. So if you haven't had a chance yet already, please do locate the chat, double check that it is checked off or the drop down is selected to go to everyone, unless you just want me to see it, which is fine as well. But I welcome you to offer up who you are, where you're from, and any other pertinent information that you'd care to provide there. For those that aren't familiar with it, the Making Sense Project is a partnership between the Pennsylvania Department of Education and Penn State University. We've been working collaboratively now for over 10 years, and this is part of an overall program focused on financial literacy and economic education here in the Commonwealth, focused on the K-12 space primarily. With the webinars that we host throughout the school year, we try and sort of fit those into one of these three pillars, if you will. So, for example, we kicked off this fall talking about the delay and the changes in the FAFSA, bringing people up to speed so they know what to expect as they were talking to seniors, in particular seniors this year. We highlight different financial literacy resources. So for example, this fall, we had folks from Take Charge Today and another organization on to share information about the curriculum and the resources that they offer. This one is on that third pillar, that sharing of professional information. So this isn't information that you're necessarily going to go back and share with students or take back and use in your classroom tomorrow, but it's certainly important for you as a professional to understand and be abreast of. In addition to today's webinars, this year we've been doing the third Thursday. We have 4 more of those. And so we encourage you, and thank you, Faith. By the way, Faith is joining me from Penn State. She is our awesome student intern at Penn State. She'll be sharing links out in the chat. So a link there to how to sign up for additional webinars. We're going to do a little bit of fun, sort of more curriculum resources that you can use in February. Sort of lighten things up with board and card games. In March, we're going to be diving into elementary and middle school financial education, in particular with the new standards reaching down into the K to all the way down to kindergarten. In April, I'm hoping to be back with another update around the legislation. So I'm going to introduce a lot of that today. It is still new. Lots of things are still being discussed, and some interpretation that needs to go around that. So I would encourage you to mark off on your calendar the 18th to come back in April as we celebrate Financial Education Month, and I can give you an additional update at that time. By the way, I apologize, it's not on these slides, but the February, all of these webinars will be offered at 7 p.m. February, April, and will be offered at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. March's will be at 4, and then in April we'll also do a 10 a.m. Specifically targeted folks, especially in administration or guidance. So join us for that. I know a couple of you are involved right now in the book study that we're doing on The Richest Man in Babylon. Both of the books that we chose this year are student-focused, ones that you could use in your classroom, either to do your own book study or take pieces in parts. The one that we have coming up this summer is on how to adult. So if you're interested in that, you can get more information or just follow along with things on our website and look for my emails, and we can get you signed up for those. So let's dive into today's content. As I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about and providing an update on personal finance standards and requirements here in Pennsylvania. I want to kick off here with a disclaimer that the opinions and any opinions and views expressed today are my own. Please don't construe anything that I might share as a position of the Pennsylvania Department of Education or Penn State University. As I mentioned earlier when we were doing the little housekeeping before, there are certainly, and I will talk about that as we go forward, some components of this that are subject to interpretation that will be forthcoming. And so please know that nothing here should be formally taken as a position, in particular PDE. So as we look at and look ahead to how I've organized the session, I will apologize in advance because it's a little policy wonky at the beginning, and maybe for some of you a little bit redundant, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about understanding the sort of how things, what influences education governance and who governs and sets policies and what have you here in Pennsylvania, because I think that helps provide some context around sort of the two kind of parallel tracks that we're on here, and that we're going to be talking about both the standards and this new legislation. And so from there, we'll go to the regulatory efforts with the standards and the legislative efforts with Act 35 of 2023 having passed last month. We'll talk a little bit about what we anticipate, or what I anticipate to be some of the local impact, and also talk about what's next. So as we go through, again, I would encourage you strongly to use that webinar chat feature either to everyone and share your question with the entire group, or you can reselect and select just to hosts and panelists that I'm the only one that sees your question if you so choose. I may or may not be able to answer them here because, again, of some of this being still subject to interpretation. Anything that any of those questions, though, I am capturing and we'll be sharing and making sure are part of what the Department of Education is considering as we look at providing whether that's some formal document, FAQs, what have you. So let's kick off. How many of you, if you can find like the little raise your hand, how many of you remember the How a Bill Becomes a Law? Do you remember the like Schoolhouse Rock version of that? So this is kind of sort of like the Pennsylvania version of that as it pertains to education. So I have here on the slide, and we're going to focus in on three areas. There is a fourth. Obviously, the federal government plays a role with education in terms of things like free and appropriate public education for all students, the need to accommodate students with special needs, what have you. But we're going to focus in primarily here today on the Pennsylvania side of things. And from there, it's sort of this three-legged stool, right, of the state legislature, the House and the Senate. And that goes back to that, harkens back to that How a Bill Becomes a Law, with, the senators and representatives in the House draft bills, put them forward, they go through the legislative process. If they make it through and are approved by the governor, they become an act, which in this case, the one that we're talking about is actually amendments to an existing law. Those all are codified in statute. We have consolidated and unconsolidated statutes here in Pennsylvania. That's further down the rabbit hole than what you need to go for this, but there's that whole sort of the legislative side. And if we think back to what we know about sort of the different portions of government, we have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, and then the judicial. This is a little bit different, but certainly the legislative branch is the same. In this case, in terms of regulation, here in Pennsylvania, that is governed by our State Board of Education, which is a 21-member board. Some of those individuals are there and serving on that board by virtue of other positions that they hold. So in particular, the minority and majority chairs of the House and Senate Education committees, by virtue of holding those appointments and those positions within the committee structure within the legislature, those 4 individuals automatically sit on the State Board of Education. The majority of the others are appointed by the governor and serve, I believe it's a 6-year term. Contrary to what some people think, the Secretary of Education doesn't actually have a vote. They are welcome to and invited to attend all of the meetings of the state board, but the Secretary of Education does not promulgate regulation here in Pennsylvania, which is different from other states and even different with other agencies, for example, in Pennsylvania. So again, this is just sort of like the inside baseball, but there's a lot of players and a lot of pieces and parts. And then perhaps the group that you're probably most familiar with in a lot of cases are your local school boards. In particular, if you're in a public school here in Pennsylvania, your district has a 9-member school board, all filled with elected individuals serving various terms, and they will set the policies for the district. The same is a similar structure if, say, for example, you are at a say a charter school or a cyber charter school or what have you. So these are really the groups that we're talking about in terms of the decisions that they make that influence the extent to which students here in Pennsylvania learn personal finance, are exposed to personal finance, and or are required to have a course in personal finance. Up until recently, the vast majority of the focus has been over here on local school boards and looking at and determining, well, how many of our local school districts have all on their own decided to either offer a course in personal finance or B, make it a requirement. I'm going to share some of the data on that, which some of you may or may not have seen, but we'll get around to that at the end when we talk about the local impact. But let's kick off in the center here with regulation. But just curious, have a little fun. There is no right or wrong answer on this one. Feel free to pop over in the chat and just curious, if you were to have to say, and again, no right or wrong answer, but who do you deem as having the most power? Like, if we were to put them on an Olympic podium, would you put the legislature, the state board, or the local boards in that #1 position? Just curious. It's just a fun question. So if you want to pop your answer into the chat, feel free, or just think about it and maybe mull it over as we go forward. So there's been a lot of things going on in terms of both legislation and regulation here in Pennsylvania, and just sort of the very recent time here. We know that legislation has been introduced around personal finance that would require a course in personal finance for many, many sessions now, honestly, going back, I would say at least probably 15, 16 years. But the first that really got a lot of traction was towards the end, or was in 2022, and that was a previous legislative session. We have 2-year legislative sessions, so that was Senate Bill 1243, or yes, 1243. So that passed. That legislative session ended. New legislation was introduced at the beginning of last year. In April, that was formally introduced. went through a very speedy process. And then we'll talk about sort of what happened with that last month here in a few minutes. So if you look at this, it's been sort of this like ping-ponging back and forth, or, if I were to put this on those parallel paths I talked about earlier, the legislative components here are in the orange, and the regulatory piece of this is in the teal. So we're going to start with what's in the teal there, which is the State Board of Education, which has followed a very predictable path, I would say, and has a predictable path going forward, kind of the most clear cut really of these. So let's start there with the State Board of Education. So the Board of Education, as I mentioned before, that 21-member board, gets together and is charged with promulgating regulation, and in some cases making changes to that on an ongoing basis. So regulations live in what's called the Pennsylvania Code. All of those pertaining to education are under what is called Title 22. Many of you may have, in particular, when we talk about standards, heard about Chapter 4. And so maybe you didn't know where Chapter 4 even what that even references, right? But Chapter 4 is the fourth chapter within Part 1 of the Education Title 22 of the Pennsylvania Code. And so this is, the formal codification of all of the rules that are issued by agencies and others with this statutory authority. So for education, it is the State Board of Education. The Department of Education does not promulgate regulation. It is the state board's responsibility. So when we look at Chapter 4 in particular, and we've looked at that quite frequently as to, so where do you sort of kind of find personal finance, right? Or where do you not? And so some of the places that we look in particular is in 4.11, the purpose of public education, 412 academic standards, 22 and 23 around middle and high school education, and a few others. So if we look right now, the way that Chapter 4 is written currently, the purpose of public education, and this list has changed over time, but right now there are 9 different areas here. So you see that these are the areas around which public schools are required to provide instruction and help develop student knowledge and skills. So ELA, math, science and technology, environment and ecology, social studies, including civics and government, geography, economics and history, arts and humanities, career education, work, health, safety and physical education, and family and consumer science. So any of these or all of these areas have standards that are related to those. Those appear then in 4.12, which is the academic standards. And, every state is a little bit differently, does things a little bit different. Here in Pennsylvania, the onus is on the local districts, local school entities, the LEAs, to design an educational program that makes sure that these academic standards are attained, and that students are demonstrating that acquisition and application of the knowledge. So the curriculum is to be designed to provide planned instruction to attain these academic standards. It is also intended to be locally assessed. So whatever is in the academic standards not only needs to be taught, but it needs to be assessed at the local level. Doing so, districts are, obviously afforded latitude and charged with making sure that they accommodate students with disabilities and or individuals, students who are having difficulty attaining the standards in a traditional manner. So, the standards have a lot, that they are, they very much are intended to drive the curriculum at the local level, and drive decisions around curriculum and planned instruction. That said, the standards aren't just supposed to be put up there and live there forever, right? There is a provision within Chapter 4 that they be revisited on an ongoing basis. And so part of what we saw here with this, with everything that's been going on, is a recognition that these 3 sets of standards, the ones that are currently a part of our focus, some of them date back, family and consumer sciences date back to 2002, economics to 2003, and career education and work to 2006. And they have not been updated in a formal manner in regulation since then. There were some informal edits, for example, and a very large shift in the economic standards some years back, but that version was never codified as part of Chapter 4. It was only on the SAS system. So these are the official dates of all of the official standards, and as you can see, these are I joke that some of these date back to the year I was married, for example. We've been together for 20 years. They were in need of a little bit of updating. So this review was initiated in September of 2022, calling on specifically these three standards to be looked at. As was mentioned in the previous slide, when this happens, the Secretary of Education or the department is charged with pulling together and providing input or receiving input from a variety of different stakeholders. This is not something that PDE just takes up and does on its own. And they didn't ask me to say, hey, Hillary, what do you think our standards should look like, right? No, they said, we need lots of input and lots of, experience from all sorts of different folks out in the field and elsewhere. And so part of the charge in bringing together groups to look at the existing standards in these three areas was to say, okay, when you look at these, are we doing justice to personal finance, basically? Do we have do the existing standards do enough? Should they be expanded, enhanced, adjusted? What should we do? And so the way that this was done was by bringing together committees, which were formed really in early 2023. And those committees met and reviewed what was in the standards, looked at what was in national standards in other states and elsewhere, and then made some recommendations and submitted a report back to the to the state board via the Department of Education. And so a major component of that really was that personal finance needs to be its own set of standards, as opposed to just little pieces and parts here and there. And so with that in mind, an additional committee was formed that was brought together with a few folks from each of those existing committees, plus some others. I won't call names, but there's a few of those on the webinar today. And so that fine group of individuals met a number of times and worked very hard to really evaluate, and look at what others have done in writing academic standards for personal finance, and then developing our own Pennsylvania version of those. And so a first iteration of those was shared with the State Board of Education in July. There was an opportunity for public feedback. Lots of feedback was received. Those committees met back again, took that. Probably the biggest piece of feedback for personal finance was shrink it down. This is too much. And so the number of standards was actually, I think, probably reduced probably about in half. And so the Department of Education reported back to the state board to let them know about that progress, and the finalization of sort of a almost final form was then brought to first the Chapter 4 committee, and then the Council for Basic Education, and then the state board, all on the same day last week in January here. So that was on the 11th, so literally 1 week ago today. The Chapter 4 committee met, had some good discussion, including how this relates to the legislation that I'll talk about in a minute. With that, an entire rulemaking or proposed rulemaking was moved forward that includes completely updated standards in those other three areas that we talked about. So the economics, the family and consumer science, the career education and work, plus changes to the general language of Chapter 4, and brand new standards for personal finance. So Faith has shared with you where you can access information on all of these, as well as download these standards. So, this is what this looks like. So, you have, the official version with the seal. I was actually kind of giddy when I got a printed copy that somebody actually like printed and stapled for me. I'm like, this is real. It was kind of fun. But if you look down at the bottom, you will notice, and if you squint really hard, it says proposed rulemaking, right? So these are not final, okay? And I want to make sure that we're very clear that these are subject to change. Will they change? I don't know. I will share with you why there is opportunity for them to change. But I cannot and do not have a crystal ball to know, to what extent they will change. Based on past iterations of standards, in the past, most of the time, what is proposed in a rulemaking is very, very similar to what ends up in the final form. But the past doesn't always predict the future, so I don't want to say that there's no chance of these changing, or that that will be limited. I just don't know. Again, sort of subject to the process, and I'll go through that in a minute. So I mentioned before that Chapter 4 updates have been proposed. So we looked at 411 earlier, the purpose of public education. If you were paying attention there were 9 areas. So in this update, we now have 10, with personal finance being listed as the 10th. Me being the dork that I was like, why is the F in finance capitalized? And I was told that that wasn't an important distinguishing thing to change at this point. But anyhow, so anyhow, anywhere that you would have seen the list of topic areas, whether that be in the purpose of public education, the list of standards, what is to be taught in primary and intermediate schools, middle schools, and high schools, personal finance has now been added, or the proposed rulemaking includes amending that with personal finance on this list. So this is our fancy little diagram that was shared with me about the Pennsylvania regulatory process as it applies to the State Board of Education. I'm going to walk you through this a little bit so that you get a sense of what I was talking about with the possibility for changes down the road. So the next stop and where these have gone off to now, I believe this week, is to the Governor's Policy Office, the Governor's Budget Office, and the Office of General Counsel. And so all 3 of those receive them at the same time, and really take a look at those and weigh in. The Attorney General then has 30 days in general to review those, unless a tolling memo is issued to extend that period of time. As I understand it, the Attorney General's office is not looking at the content of these. It's really more the legality of it and making sure that everything is legal in this process. At that point, once the Attorney General's office sort of signs off and says we're done, it is sent to 3 places at once, technically 4, but anyhow, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, which is often that acronym IRRC is often referred to as IRC. The Legislative Reference Bureau, and where it goes from there is for publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And then also, that's why I said really it's 4, because it goes to the House and the Senate Education Committees for their input and review. And so these all get their hands on it, and when the Legislative Reference Bureau receives it and publishes this in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, that triggers the beginning of a 30-day public comment period. Now, the State Board of Education, if you recall a few slides back, already had one, very open opportunity for organizations and individuals and entities to provide public feedback, both through in-person testimony, but also through written testimony. So, the hope is that a lot of what, organizations might have, maybe if there were concerns or what have you, that a lot of that was already addressed. But, you never know what'll happen during this process. So the way that this works is that the department, excuse me, the Board of Education, the state board, will be responsible for receiving those comments and then replying to each and every one of them. And so after those comments are received, if it is deemed that there are either through those comments or feedback from elsewhere in the process, so there are any other edits that need to be made, there is that possibility that it could do that and sort of goes back through this sort of lather, rinse, repeat cycle. If not, then it would just sort of continue to move forward in formal final form, then back to ARC and for the HE. So again, no crystal ball, but what I can tell you is if you look carefully at what is in the proposed amendments to Chapter 4, you will see that at various points with the new standards that have been proposed in personal finance, or and well as the amendments or the new versions of the other three areas, that the current draft has these taking effect on July 1st, 2026, which at this point has been deemed, they believe, sort of a reasonable time frame for all of this to go through and move through the regulatory process and for implementation to begin. So that's, again, probably more than you wanted to know about the inner workings of this, but I think it's important, as opposed to just say, hey, Pennsylvania has new standards, woohoo, yay, let's go, let's keep going, to understand that, it is very likely that these standards could go through and exactly in the same format they are, word for word, but there are also chances that, some things could get changed. And we don't know that until everything is said and done with the standards and we do have a final form. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of, what that means at the local level in a few minutes. But that's sort of where we are. So let's take a look at the actual standards for a few minutes and dive into these. I'm sure most of you on this webinar have looked at various versions of either Pennsylvania standards or academic standards elsewhere. One of the things that we did in the work of the committees, all four committees, with career education work, family consumer sciences, and economics and personal finance, was to align around common grade banding. So the first grade band is K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12, trying to bring those all into alignment. They were not before, and so in particular, there could be challenges where, well, this was in a certain thing and a certain one, and it's kind of the same content. Like where does that overlap? And so attempting to make things as clean as possible from that perspective. This is one that I know a couple of people have already asked me. They're like, why is it 17 when it's number 10 on the list? And a lot of that has to do with the way that standards have been introduced in the past. Not every set of standards that have been put out there by the Department of Education or others, they've all been numbered sequentially, but not all of them are part of Chapter 4. And so, there are standards, for example, for BCIT. There are standards for driver's education and other things that are numbered, but are not in Chapter 4. So that's the reason for the difference. So personal finance should become number 17, which means then each of these areas, sort of the big buckets, if you will, become 17.1, 0.2, what have you, with this list here of topics. If you've been around me long enough, you may have heard me say, because it's a phrase I use quite often, that there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of slice the personal finance pie, right? And we've seen that done with previous iterations. For example, once upon a time when there were two sets of national standards from, the Jumpstart Coalition as well as the Council for Economic Education. We see I've seen, I don't know how many different ways to slice and dice this depending on different, curriculum or, teachers that divide things down into different units. There is no right or wrong. The committee really took a look at what others were doing, both, the national level and in other states, what they were doing in their own classrooms and in their own schools, and then, what they thought made the most sense. And so, at some point we'll probably be working and I actually did sort of an informal alignment of this version of the standards to the national standards. I think we've covered them incredibly well if if you're familiar with the national standards from Jumpstart and CEE. Just organized in a little bit different way. And I dare say we filled in some gaps where I think there have been some at the national level as well. So if you dive in and you're looking at this document, it looks probably has a very familiar, I think, sort of template, if you will, with these areas divided then into substrands. And so within each of those substrands, a series of actual standards. Standards, by the way, here in Pennsylvania are very much content standards. They describe what a student should be able to do. These are not just statements of fact, like you'll see in other versions from either the national standards or from other states. These are much more action oriented, what you would expect a student to be able to do and demonstrate. You'll notice a big difference, for example, in the economics, and others are written in this same way. The original sets of standards, when those were being developed, the guidance was very clear to those that were involved in that, as I was once upon a time in the writing of the economic standards in the late 90s and early 2000s. We had to have every single box filled. So if there was a standard at grade 9 through 12, we were directed that there had to be something in the lower grade levels. The committees it was very clear that there was not that type of a requirement if this was age appropriate standards and developmentally appropriate for the upper levels and not for the younger levels. It was completely okay and recommended that there not be extra or superfluous standards written just to fill the boxes. So you'll see here as I go further into area 1, a bunch of these that are left intentionally blank. And so now that does and may confuse people a little bit around the numbering. So each of these rows has its own letter. And then, so, if you were to list only, say, for example, the kindergarten to grade 2 standards, it's going to jump from point C here under financial mindset and behaviors to point F here under financial services. There is no D and E. And that was done intentionally. So that is the way these have been coded and numbered for the ease of reference moving forward. So feel free to download that document, really dive into it. This slide and the next one is pretty much sort of an outline of what you'll find within each of those areas, what those substrands are. You can see that there are more for some and less for others. And really tried to be, pretty clear in what was in each of those with by naming each of those substrands. And again, some of those do have more than one standard. So, for example, under financial services, you'll find 3 standards at the 9 through 12 in that substrand, and only 1 in each of the others. So, again, it'll vary by topic. One thing that I want to be very clear is that standards are not curriculum, right? We already talked about that the standards say what students should be able to do, but not necessarily how they accomplish that or how they demonstrate that they can. And so that is very much an implementation component. Standards are not curriculum, and local school entities very much have local control over determining the curriculum and the instruction that will be designed to accomplish the standards. And so, to be clear, here in Pennsylvania, there is no statewide curriculum for personal finance or anything else. There's not an approved list of textbooks or reading lists or curriculum or anything like that. That is left to local school entities to determine. All that said, when these are implemented, schools then will be responsible for planned instruction and local assessment aligned to these new personal finance standards. So everything that is required right now of schools around the STEEL standards and the math standards and the ELA standards and all of the career education and work, when it comes to planned instruction and a local assessment, is going to be required around personal finance if implemented. The obvious variation would be, this is, there's no indication that this will be a tested subject at the state level. So, this would all be locally assessed with students demonstrating their comprehension at the local level, and that information being shared and part of the district's plan for local assessment. So one of the questions that I have for you, and this may be more to noodle on than to reply in the moment, but and a lot of this will depend on your perspective and your role, whether you're, for example, a classroom teacher or someone sitting in a school or district administrative office or an intermediate unit, or an organization that is interested in helping to support implementation, is what resources do you think would be most helpful in implementing these new personal finance standards? And so we knew this was coming on the standards side, and so we've been spending some time really looking at what has been done first around personal finance here in Pennsylvania. We have a model personal finance framework, instructional framework, and some other resources that currently live on SAS. We've known, and we were originally going to update those a while back with the new standards, and we knew this was coming, so we've held off. So we know what we've done there. We're interested in how useful that is, and what we're going to be able to offer. We know what other states have done, and so we're really looking at that. If you'd like to be a part of this, Faith has shared the Google form where you can provide your contact information and let us know a little bit about yourself and how you might be interested in getting involved, whether that's in looking at things from other places, helping us to sort of develop the template, if you will, and or actually diving into the implementation resources themselves. Because we are very much at the beginning of this process, we don't know exactly what that work is going to look like, if it's all going to be done virtually, if there will be opportunities to engage in person. But as I'll dive into here in a minute, the Department of Education is on the hook to develop or update its financial literacy model curriculum and resources by the 25-26 school year. So that really means having the remainder of this school year and next to develop that. Okay, so looking at the other three areas, I want to turn to legislation, and I know many of you might be most interested, in particular at the high school level, in recent legislative activity, which I will tell you, I did not see coming, and neither did a lot of other folks. We knew that, we knew that there was legislation out there that would do what we'll share in a minute, but it had just been sitting. And the legislation would amend the Public School Code of 1949. So this is the law, really, that when we talk about school law in here, Pennsylvania, this is really what we're talking about. And so, as I mentioned, lots of things going on. And then in December, on the 13th, what became Act 35, this Senate bill, this was an omnibus amendments. So that means that there was a piece of legislation that was moving, and then a whole bunch of other things kind of got added in, and rather at the last moment. So this is how that happened, and it contains lots and lots of changes to the school law. So if you are to go in and really dive in to Act 35, you'll be scrolling and scrolling and scrolling forever. I would encourage you to do a Command F, or find and look for section 1551. And so this is really where you'll see what was added or changed. Everything on this screenshot, I know it's too small to actually read, but if you can look at the difference, everything in the unbolded portion was there before, everything bolded is new. And if you look at the rest of this big long act, you'll see that there's lots that was put into this omnibus bill. So let me just, I'll get sort of the probably less important to you part out first, and then get to the main dish, if you will. Part of this does require that PDE update the model personal finance curriculum by the 25-26 school year, as we talked about, as well as developing or identifying model curriculum for the mandatory course in consultation with multiple organizations specializing in financial literacy education. And this has been very important to many individuals, clarifying which certifications are necessary to teach, in particular, this mandatory course, to include the BCIT, or Business, Family, Consumer Sciences, Math, and Social Studies certifications, as well as various historic iterations of those. So, there are still some home economics certifications, some distributive education, and others over on the BCIT side. So expecting some formal clarification around that. This is the paragraph that has excited people the most, beginning with the 2026-2027 school year, and in each school year thereafter, a school entity or non-public school shall provide a mandatory course in personal financial literacy with a value of at least 1/2 credit or half of a full credit. Students shall be required to complete the course once during grade 9, 10, 11, or 12. Okay, so that's what's in the legislation. And I've been getting calls, texts, emails, messages with questions, because this leaves some things up for interpretation. And so, as I mentioned before, the Department of Education anticipates needing to provide some interpretation and some clarification around some aspects of these. So, looking at each of these, this has to happen, must have a mandatory personal finance course in place by the 2026-27 school year. The course needs to be a 1/2 credit or more. Students need to complete the course while in high school. It applies not only to public schools, but to private schools as well, which is a little bit unique. So some of the questions that I've been fielding and are very much on our radar right now around this is, okay, well, if you say the 26-27 school year, and the legislation does this, for example, mean that the class of 2027 or today's current 9th graders must have completed this course before they graduate? Because it does say, if we go back there, it says students shall be required to complete the course once during grade 9, 10, 11, or 12. So does that mean that they will have to do it in their 12th grade year if they haven't already? So that is a question that is currently subject to interpretation, around which we are hoping to have answers sooner rather than later, but that is an outstanding question to be answered. What does it mean to be a 1/2 a credit, right? Is there perhaps a seat time equivalent to that? If you really dive in, and by the way, this is one of those points, I probably should have made a slide about it. Sometimes people are like, oh, but Pennsylvania does have a list of graduation requirements. See, I can find it right here in chapter 4. And they point to, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, but basically it's this list that's there for non-public schools. It doesn't have anything to do with public schools. And that list does have a seat time, basically a seat time or clock hours equivalent tied to what a credit is. Will a PDE interpret it to be, similar as it is there? I don't know. That is again subject for interpretation. And then the other really big one is students will be required to complete the course while in high school. Well, what does completion look like? What does that mean? Does that mean that they have to have a passing grade? What is a passing grade? What does successful completion of that course look like? How will completion be reported? If a student, say, for example, takes this as a semester, let's just say that a semester's worth course or one semester course taken their second semester of their senior year and they fail it. Does that mean they completed the course? Do they still get to graduate, right? Those are the kinds of questions that right now are subject for interpretation and clarification. And I expect and know that PDE will have something forthcoming around that. Right now, one of the things that we're really trying to do is capture what are all the questions that are out there so that we can try and do our best to answer as many as we can in one fell swoop. So if there are questions that you have or that others within your organization or your district or your school have that aren't reflected in the ones here, and I know there's some others, please make sure that you share those with me sooner rather than later. An email would be fine. If you want to set up a time to talk and share some of those questions, feel free. But the sooner that you can do that, the better in terms of helping us to make sure that we come up with the best documentation and the best resources to support educators in understanding the impact of this. So that goes to that, what additional questions do you have? And so please, let me know. You're welcome to pop some of those in the chat now if you wish. But those are really the kinds of things that we're looking for and trying to answer. And again, if you are somebody that would like to be a part of developing resources to support implementation, either the actual, sort of content vetting and piece, or even just on the upfront piece, kicking off even sooner, will be looking at sort of what are those templates that we want to use, what information is most helpful and usable for educators as they look at the development of a new mandatory course tied to those standards, as well as K-8 standards, and looking at how to implement those. From a national perspective, lots of folks are very excited. I've been working in the field of financial education for over 20 years. I will admit that when I heard this legislation passed, I actually looked out the window and said, "Are pigs flying?" Because I used to say, pigs will fly and other things will happen before this happens in Pennsylvania, and I have had to eat my words. But Pennsylvania is considered sort of the tipping point because we became the 25th state. So you see here some news articles from CNBC, Education Week, and quite a few others. If we look back just a few years, so pre-pandemic, there were 6 states. 2020, there were 8. We are now at 25. So again, that sort of tipping point, reaching the halfway point in terms of the number of states that are or will guarantee that a student takes a personal finance course. So as of yesterday, this was the list. Who knows what happened somewhere today? But these are the states, the lighter, this middle tone here are the ones that are now in the process of implementing that requirement. The darker oranges are the ones where the requirement or that guarantee is already in effect. So like many things, things roll in, so it's not necessarily, you wouldn't pass legislation this year that says it's required of the class of 2024. That's not fair, right? Their schedules are set in stone. It doesn't give enough of an on-ramp. So, in terms of that and maps like this, I would expect Pennsylvania to continue to stay in that, process of implementing phase until the 26-27 school year when this goes into effect. We've been seeing a lot of buzz on the in local media across the state, both in print and in nighttime newscasts. I got an email yesterday from somebody that I know well who had seen this other great this great teacher on the news. It was like, hey, a star in our midst. And so I keep seeing them. If you see other stories and want to share those or pass those along, I would appreciate it. Last but not least is sort of what is the expected impact of this, right? How big of a lift is this? And so when we look at local school districts, we sort of put them into different buckets and categorize them on those that already have a standalone required course. And those that have a standalone course but don't require it, they have it as an elective. Those that have personal finance embedded in another course. So maybe it's a unit within their economics course, or it's part of an overall course in family and consumer sciences that's either required or elective. And so we put all of the school districts that have high schools, there are some that don't, into one of these four buckets, and then we actually further subdivide the two on the left. And so when we do that and we look at the state as a whole, we can see that these dark green, the darker shade of green here, those, unless there's something, that changes, I would imagine will are basically already fulfilling this legislation. They have a course. In this case, when we reviewed these, we looked at whether or not that was the equivalent of a semester or more, because that's considered in some of the research to be the tipping point for whether or not a course content is enough. And it just so happens that the legislation picked a half of a credit, which in most cases equates to a semester. When we looked at districts that are on, say, a semester block system, where a one semester course is actually a full credit, we made the adjustments accordingly. So those dark greens, pretty much they've already have the box checked. The light greens, in some cases, in a lot of cases, those are courses that just aren't a full semester's worth of content. And so maybe it's a 9 weeks, or maybe it's 2 days out of every 6-day cycle. So, a third of a credit. And so then we look at similar differentiation between the darker and the lighter shades of teal, where those are all elective courses. So that means that they already have a curriculum. So a lot of people are like, whoa, what are we going to do? What are we going to teach? Or how many, how are schools going to figure this out? So, when we look at this, or when I look at this, what this says to me, at least, is every one of those districts that's green or teal already has somebody there that knows how to teach this and already has it figured out. It may not be a full semester in length, it may not be perfectly aligned to the standards, but for the most part, they have that component sort of nailed down. The bigger piece, I think, and what a lot of districts are really trying to wrap their arms around is, what does this look like from a master schedule perspective? How do I get every student into a one semester course? How do I work that into my master schedule? Who am I going to have that teaches that? What is that going to have in terms of a ripple effect on, what other courses they may or may not be able to teach? Am I going to have to bring in teachers maybe that haven't taught this before, but that have the certification to be able to, and get them up to speed? So it's a lot of that is a logistics challenge. But it's not necessarily a curriculum challenge. And so, the ones that are going to have, I think, a little bit more in terms of there's actually only 2 districts that have no personal finance offered at all. So, in the grand scheme of things, when we look at these by the numbers, a lot of our districts are already there. And well over half are at least have figured out the curriculum side. That's not to say that the other piece isn't a big piece. I'm married to a retired school and district administrator. I understand the challenges of building master schedules and sort of what this does, as well as the potential of looking at staffing. So I'm not trying to downplay that, but at least the curriculum piece is sort of covered. So when it comes to the what's next, I sort of bucket organizations and teachers and administrators and what have you into one of three potential responses. The dolphins, they're like, yes, good. Give me those not quite yet final form standards. We're going to get going. I'm going to get teams together. We're going to start reading these. Okay, let's see, 26, 27, that's around the corner. Let's see if we can make this a graduation requirement starting next year. Like they're working. They're going to get ahead of it. They're going to be proactive. We have some folks that I'm sure are going to be ostriches that are like, hey, maybe they'll change their mind. Maybe this won't happen. Maybe I'll be retired by the time this happens and I'll leave it to the next person in this seat. They're just going to like ignore it for a while. And then there's the folks that are like, okay, let's see what happens. Get back to me. And, I'll get to this in a little while. I'm open to the change. I'm going to listen, think, what have you. I'm not necessarily going to be the one that's going to be ahead of the curve. So we're expecting responses all along the line. And we want to make sure that we provide resources to everybody, regardless of their position and where they are on that. So I'd encourage you to reach out and be in touch with me. Let me know if you have questions that I can make sure are addressed in any future version of what comes out from PDE in a very formal sense in terms of that interpretation of the legislation in particular, or anything else that we can do. And again, I would strongly encourage you to fill out that Google form that we shared earlier about being a part of the process. So again, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. We're figuring that out in terms of budget and timing and how many people to involve and all of that sort of stuff. But I expect to get moving on that sooner rather than later. So I thank you all for your time and your willingness to be here with us this afternoon to find out the latest and greatest update, and hope that you'll continue to sort of continue to plug in on where things are and where things stand. So thank you again so very much, and I appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you on another one of these updates in the future. One reminder, again, the third Thursdays we have our webinars, so please, plan to attend one or more of these that may be of interest. Those book studies that are coming up, and again, thank you for your participation.